before we begin, think about this for a moment. How can someone write about the beginning of the world if they weren't there to see it? And yet, for thousands of years, millions have read the words of Moses in the book of Genesis and believed them to be true. So how is that possible? Stay with this story, because by the end, you might see Genesis in a completely different way. And before we go deeper, write in the comments, do you believe Genesis was revealed or remembered? The desert was silent, not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that presses against your chest, heavy and endless. Moses stood alone, far from the camp of Israel. The people were restless again, complaining, doubting, forgetting everything they had seen. The miracles, the plagues, the sea split in two. It was as if memory itself was slipping away from them. But Moses remembered. He remembered the burning bush, the voice that spoke from fire without consuming it, the voice of God. And now, once again, that same presence was drawing him away from the noise of the people into solitude, into revelation. The mountain loomed ahead, Mount Sinai, sharp, silent, sacred. This was not the first time Moses had climbed it, but this time felt different. There were no thunderclaps, no trembling earth, no visible fire, just stillness. And in that stillness, something began. Not a voice at first, but images, clearer than memory, stronger than imagination. Moses closed his eyes, and suddenly he was no longer in the desert. Darkness, not night, but something deeper, a void without form, without shape. Then light, not rising slowly like the sun, but bursting into existence. Let there be light. The words weren't spoken aloud, and yet Moses heard them, felt them, understood them. He wasn't watching a story. He was witnessing a beginning. Day by day, the world unfolded before him. Waters separated. Skies stretched out like a curtain. Land rose from the deep. Plants covered the earth. Then the stars scattered across the heavens like countless sparks. Moses saw it all, not as a man reading history, but as someone standing inside it. Time didn't move the way he understood it. A single day held more than a lifetime, and yet it was ordered, intentional, complete. Then came something different, something personal, the dust of the ground, the breath of life. A man, Adam. Moses felt the moment as if it echoed through every human soul, not just creation, but connection. And then another, Eve, not made from dust, but from the man himself. Unity, relationship, purpose. Moses didn't just see them. He understood them. The garden appeared next. Lush, perfect, untouched by decay. Garden of Eden. But even here, something felt fragile. A choice, a boundary, a single command. And then the serpent. Not just an animal, but something more, something aware, something that twisted truth just enough to make it dangerous. Moses felt the tension build. The question, the doubt, the decision, and then the fall. It wasn't loud. No explosion. No thunder. Just a shift, a fracture, like something invisible had broken, but could never be repaired the same way again. Shame entered. Fear followed. And for the first time, humans hid. Moses felt it deeply, because he had seen that same fear in his own people. The vision continued. Generations passed like shadows moving across the earth. Names, lives, stories, and then violence, corruption, a world unraveling, until one man stood apart. Noah. Moses saw the flood not as a distant event, but as overwhelming reality. Waters rising, the ark lifting, the world being washed clean, and yet marked forever. Then came a promise, a covenant, a rainbow stretched across the sky. Hope after judgment. The visions didn't stop there. Moses saw the rise of nations, the pride of humanity. Tower of Babel, voices united, then divided, languages scattering like broken pieces of a single voice. And then a man called out from among many, Abraham. Moses watched as God chose him, not because he was powerful, but because he would believe. That was the pattern, not only with Abraham, but again and again through the story Moses was being shown. God did not seem drawn to the strongest city, the loudest king, or the most polished man in the room. He moved toward the one who listened, the one who trusted, the one who obeyed when obedience made no human sense. Abraham had no empire, no army that terrified nations, no throne carved from gold. He only had a promise, and yet that promise seemed to carry more weight than the walls of mighty kingdoms. Moses watched Abraham leave what was familiar. He saw him walk under foreign skies with nothing but the word of God holding his future together. He saw tents instead of palaces, altars instead of monuments, dust on his feet instead of crowns on his head. And still, heaven called him blessed. Then the vision shifted. Years passed in moments. Seasons folded into one another. The sound of desert winds became the cries of servants, the bleating of flocks, the laughter of children, the silence of long waiting. Moses watched Abraham age. He watched Sarah wait. He watched promise stretch so long that it seemed almost cruel, because that is often how divine things feel before they happen. At first, a promise sounds glorious. Then time passes. Then the body grows tired. Then people begin to whisper. Then logic steps in and says, this is not going to happen. Moses knew that feeling. He had heard a promise too. Israel would be free. Israel would be led. Israel would become a nation devoted to the Lord. But the wilderness had a way of making every promise feel distant. Hunger did that. Fatigue did that. Fear did that. So as Moses watched Abraham and Sarah waiting beyond the age of hope, he did not watch as a stranger. He watched as a man who understood what it meant to hold on while the visible world mocked the invisible word. Then came Isaac, not just a son, a crack in the wall of impossibility, a child born into laughter because the whole thing sounded absurd until it became real. Moses saw Abraham hold him, saw Sarah's face softened by the joy she no longer thought she would live to see, saw servants whisper in amazement, saw the promise take breath and cry and smile. And Moses felt something stir in him. The God who began the world with speech was not limited by age, barren places, dead ends, or human timing. He could start life where life looked finished. He could call something forth when all evidence said silence would remain. The vision moved again. Now there was mountain air, tension, wood, a son walking beside his father. Isaac old enough to notice what was missing. The fire and the wood are here. The boy asked, but where is the lamb? Moses felt the weight of the moment before Abraham answered. God will provide. It was not a casual answer. It was the kind of sentence a man speaks when he has nothing left to stand on except trust. Moses watched them climb. He saw Abraham's face lined by years and obedience. He saw Isaac's innocence. He saw the altar rise stone by stone. He saw the knife lifted into the silence. And then the interruption. Mercy from heaven. A ram caught in the thicket. Provision in the place of loss. Moses felt his chest tighten. This, too, was part of the story. God was not merely building a nation. He was teaching a pattern, a mystery, a language of sacrifice, substitution, covenant, and rescue, the beginnings of things hidden inside visible acts. And Moses sensed that Genesis was not merely a record of what had happened. It was a map, a beginning that contained seeds of everything that would follow. The vision flowed forward. Isaac grew older. Rebekah entered the story. Then twins. Esau first, red and wild. Jacob second, grasping the heel as if already refusing to be left behind. Moses watched their lives spread apart like two roads splitting in opposite directions. One was immediate, driven by appetite. The other was restless, calculating, hungry for something deeper, and yet often willing to reach for it in crooked ways. Moses recognized that too, because Israel itself was like that. A people called toward holy things, yet constantly pulled toward shortcuts, idols, and the comfort of what could be grasped quickly. He watched Jacob bargain for a birthright. He watched deception stain the household. He watched the father's blessing become the center of rivalry and grief. He watched Esau's pain burn hot. He watched Jacob flee under the shadow of his own manipulation. And yet, even here, the story did not end in rejection, because the God Moses was seeing was unlike men. Men discarded the flawed. God pursued them. Night fell over the vision, and Jacob lay sleeping with a stone beneath his head. Then heaven opened, a ladder, or perhaps a stairway, something stretching between earth and the unseen realm. messengers ascending and descending, a connection Jacob had not earned and could not control. Moses stared. This was what men did not understand. The distance between heaven and earth could not be crossed by cleverness. It could not be bought, inherited, manipulated, or seized. It had to be opened by God. And God spoke over Jacob not because Jacob was clean, but because God was faithful to what he had promised Abraham and Isaac before him. Moses felt the lesson enter his bones. The covenant was never sustained by human perfection. It was sustained by divine faithfulness. That did not make sin small. It made grace astonishing. The vision pressed onward. Jacob labored. Jacob loved. Jacob was deceived by Laban, as he had deceived his own father. Years piled upon years. Rachel and Leah entered the tangled history of pain and longing. Children were born into rivalry and hope. Tribes began to take shape, though they hardly looked glorious. They looked messy, like families always do, like promises and progress always do. Moses watched sons grow into men. He watched jealousy harden among brothers. He watched the father's love settle visibly upon one son and quietly poison the atmosphere of the household. Joseph, the dreamer, favored, radiant, unguarded enough to speak of dreams that suggested his brothers would one day bow to him. Moses could almost feel the resentment before it erupted. He watched them in the fields. He heard the bitterness in their voices. He saw the moment when hatred ripened into action. The pit, that dark, swallowing whole the earth. Joseph's cries rising from below. Moses flinched, because all men know the horror of betrayal. But betrayal by brothers carries a special darkness. The vision did not spare him. He watched Judah suggest profit instead of murder. He watched silver exchanged for flesh. He watched Joseph dragged away into Egypt while the brothers rehearsed their lie. He saw Jacob collapse beneath the false evidence of blood. Pain spread through the household like winter. For a moment, the entire promise seemed threatened by envy alone. But then the vision widened. Egypt, massive, ordered, powerful. Moses felt something in him tremble, because Egypt was not a distant place to him. It was the house of his own earlier life, the land of his birth and exile, the kingdom whose wisdom, arrogance, and cruelty had shaped him before God broke him in the desert. Now he watched Joseph enter it not as a prince, but as property, sold, measured, owned, and yet heaven had not left him. This amazed Moses, because men assume God is present in altars, mountains, moments of miracle. But here in a foreign household, in slavery, under injustice, God was still moving. Joseph served. Joseph was tested. Joseph was falsely accused. Joseph was cast into prison, one descent after another, and yet each downward step seemed secretly guided toward something higher. Moses watched prison walls close around him. He watched forgotten years pass. He watched the cupbearer restore his own life and forget the man who had interpreted his dream. Forgotten, that word lingered. Moses knew how long forgotten years can feel. 40 years in Midian could do that to a man. But heaven had not forgotten Joseph, nor had it forgotten Moses, nor would it forget Israel. Then came Pharaoh's troubling dreams. Cows, grain, plenty devoured by famine. Joseph was summoned, and suddenly, after years of confinement, the prisoner stood before power. Moses watched the whole scene with fierce attention. He knew the atmosphere of royal chambers. He knew the scent of polished stone and guarded pride. He knew how rulers carried themselves when they believed the world bent around their will. Yet Joseph stood there with a calm that did not come from status. "It is not in me," Joseph said, giving glory to God before the throne. Moses felt that sentence strike him. That was a secret. Not in me, not in my strength, not in my wisdom, not in my authority, not in my eloquence, not in me. For how many years had Moses struggled against his own weakness? He had told God he was slow of speech. He had feared Pharaoh. He had doubted himself before the call was fully accepted. And even now, after miracles, leadership still exposes limits daily. But Joseph's witness cut through all of that. God does not need men who are enough. He calls men who know they are not. The vision rushed onward. Joseph exalted. Egypt preserved. Nations coming to buy grain. The world bent by famine toward the very brother once cast into a pit. Then came the meeting. The brothers arriving, unaware. Joseph seeing them before they recognized him. Years of grief and power colliding inside one man's heart. Moses watched every glance, every test, every hidden tear. This was not vengeance. It was something deeper. Joseph was not merely exposing guilt. He was uncovering whether repentance had entered the family that once destroyed him. Then Judah stepped forward. Judah, who had once sold his brother, now offering himself in place of Benjamin. Moses watched this with awe. Men can change. Not perfectly, not instantly, but the grace of God can take the very one who once profited from betrayal and turn him into a man willing to suffer for another. Joseph broke. The room changed. The revelation burst forth. I am Joseph. Moses felt the trembling in that sentence. Not only the shock of identity restored, but the staggering truth behind Joseph's tears. You meant evil against me, but God meant for good. There was again the hidden hand, the invisible sovereignty threading through human sin without becoming stained by it, taking wicked intention and bending it toward deliverance. Moses stood within the vision and understood something about his own life he had never fully seen. Egypt had shaped him. Pharaoh had threatened him. His own people had doubted him. His anger had exiled him. The wilderness had broken him. And yet none of it had escaped the hand of God. Nothing was random. Nothing was wasted. Even what men meant for evil could be taken up into a purpose larger than their cruelty. Then Jacob came down into Egypt. The family was preserved. The promise survived famine. But as the vision moved further, Moses felt the mood darken. Time passed. Joseph died. His generation faded. A new Pharaoh arose who did not remember. That sentence carried a chill. Did not remember. So much of human evil begins there. When gratitude disappears. When history is severed. When blessing received is no longer honored. When fear replaces memory. Moses now saw his own people swelling in number inside Egypt. The descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob multiplying just as promised. But what should have been seen as evidence of divine faithfulness was seen by Pharaoh as a threat. Fear became policy. Policy became oppression. Oppression became slaughter. Moses watched taskmasters driving Hebrew slaves beneath the burning sun. He heard the cracks of command, the cries of exhaustion, the suffocating grind of brick and mud. He saw mothers hide sons. He saw fathers forced into silence. He felt the terror that settled over the camps when the decree spread that newborn boys were to die. His own breath caught. Now the vision had reached him. Not Moses the old man on the mountain, but Moses the child. A basket, water, a mother's tears, a sister watching from the reeds, an Egyptian princess. The strange mercy that preserved a Hebrew child inside the house of the oppressor. Moses watched himself with a kind of holy fear. He saw how fragile it all was, how easily one shift of wind, one careless eye, one different mood in Pharaoh's daughter, and his life would have ended before it began. But God had been there too, before the burning bush, before Sinai, before the rod, before the sea. God had been there in reeds and water and a mother's trembling hands. Moses watched himself grow between worlds, Hebrew by blood, Egyptian by upbringing, privileged and yet displaced, educated and yet inwardly unsettled. He remembered things now with deeper clarity than memory alone had ever allowed. He saw his younger face in palace halls. He saw the pride that still clung to him then. He saw the unformed desire to deliver his people by his own hand. Then came the killing. The Egyptians struck down in secret, the sand covering the body. The illusion of control shattered the next day, when Moses realized the deed was known. He watched his younger self flee, not heroic now, just afraid. And again Moses felt the deep pattern of Genesis echo into his own life. Abraham had to leave. Jacob had to flee. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Now Moses fled into Midian. The chosen were never chosen because they looked impressive at the beginning. They were often broken in transit. The vision followed him into wilderness years. Sheep, sand, silence. The long hidden season where ambition dies slowly and a man learns how little he is. Then the bush burned. Moses knew this moment. Yet now he saw it as part of a much older pattern. The God of Genesis was the God of Exodus. The one who spoke light into being was the one speaking from a flame. The one who called Abraham was the one now calling Moses. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That name from the bush now echoed with fresh depth. Genesis had not been a disconnected ancient tale. It was a living foundation beneath Moses' own calling. God introduced himself through covenant history, because history itself was revelation. Moses watched once more his resistance. Who am I? What if they do not believe me? I am not eloquent. Send someone else. And he saw with painful tenderness how patient God had been. Moses lowered his head in the vision. How often had he thought leadership depended on removing weakness? Yet the Lord seemed willing to work through trembling, slowness, fear, and insufficiency so that the power would clearly be his. The vision rolled like thunder into confrontation. Pharaoh, Aaron, the staff, the signs. Again and again Moses saw hardness. Pharaoh's face unbending, pride calcified into rebellion. The Egyptian magicians mimicking enough to encourage delusion, but not enough to save anyone from judgment. Then plague after plague. The Nile struck. Frogs, gnats, flies, livestock ruined, boils, hail, locusts, darkness. Creation itself became a courtroom. Moses noticed something he had not fully seen before. The same God who ordered waters, skies, land, light, and living creatures in Genesis now used those very elements against Egypt. It was as if creation obeyed its maker even in judgment. The world was not self-governing. It remained under divine authority. And then Passover, the night of blood on doorposts, the lamb, the warning, the urgency, the trembling households waiting inside while death moved through Egypt. Moses watched Hebrew fathers paint the doorframes. He watched mothers gather children close. He watched the shadowed hours pass. He heard cries rise from Egyptian homes when morning came. Deliverance and judgment intertwined. Moses shuddered, because he felt in that night something ancient from the story of Abraham and Isaac. Once again, provision stood in the place of destruction. Once again, blood marked a path of mercy through looming death. Then the release. Israel pouring out of Egypt. The wealth of former masters in their hands. The impossible finally real. And yet, freedom was not simple. Pharaoh pursued. The sea stood ahead. Panic spread behind him like fire. Moses watched himself stand with the staff over the waters. He remembered the terror. He remembered the command to move forward. He remembered the wind, the walls of sea, the ground beneath countless feet. Now, from within the greater story, he understood it differently. Genesis had begun with waters and the Spirit of God moving. Now a nation was being brought through waters into new identity. Creation, recreation. The God who formed a world was now forming a people. The sea collapsed. Egypt drowned. Israel sang. For a moment it seemed as if the story might become simple after that. But Moses knew better. The wilderness came, and with it complaint, always complaint. Hunger, thirst, fear, memory twisted backward until slavery itself began to look attractive, simply because it had been familiar. Moses watched the people murmur in waves. He saw manna fall and still heard dissatisfaction. He saw water come from rock and still sensed distrust beneath the surface. He saw Amalek attack. He saw his own hands lifted while Israel prevailed, lower when his strength failed. Even victory required support. Aaron and her standing beside him, one on one side, one on the other. Moses felt the lesson all over again. No servant of God stands by his own strength for long. Then Sinai, the mountain blazing, the people trembling, the voice of God terrible and holy. Moses saw himself ascend in the cloud, receive the covenant, stand between heaven's fire and Israel's fear. And yet below, while glory still covered the mountain, the people shaped a calf of gold. Moses shut his eyes at the memory, even as he watched it unfold. How quickly men turn revelation into religion on their own terms. How quickly they replace the invisible God with something they can manage. How quickly fear becomes idolatry when trust is absent. And in that terrible moment, Moses understood why Genesis had to begin at the beginning. Because sin in the wilderness was not new. The calf was not a sudden failure of one generation. It was Eden repeating itself. A refusal to trust the word of God. A desire to possess certainty through visible things. a turning from covenant into self-made worship. The same fracture that entered with Adam lived in Israel too. Moses saw the tablets shattered. He saw judgment fall. He saw himself stand in intercession for the people, pleading that they not be destroyed. Then he understood another layer. Abraham had interceded. Jacob had wrestled. Joseph had forgiven. Now Moses was standing in a line of covenant men, each bearing in some way the burden of others. Genesis was not only the beginning of events. It was the beginning of patterns of mediation, sacrifice, promise, failure, and mercy. The vision deepened further still. Moses began to see connections he had never articulated, though his spirit had felt them for years. Adam in a garden, tested in abundance, falling into shame. Israel in a wilderness, tested in lack, falling into complaint. Noah passing through waters into a remade world. Israel passing through waters into a newly formed nation. Abraham leaving his father's house by faith. Israel leaving Egypt by faith, though weakly. Isaac laid on would yet spare by provision. Passover lamb slain so firstborn sons could live. Jacob wrestling through the night until blessing emerged. Israel wrestling through wilderness until identity would be sealed. Joseph descending into humiliation to become the means of preservation for many. Moses descending from prince to shepherd to lead multitudes into deliverance. It was all one story, not scattered episodes. One unfolding testimony of a God who remained faithful while humanity remained unstable. Moses could hardly bear the weight of it, and still the vision was not done. He was shown, not in clear detail, but in glimpses that felt like distant thunder, that the story stretching from Genesis into his own day did not stop with him. He saw the tribes settled in a land not yet possessed. He saw judges rise in chaos. He saw kings. He saw songs and swords. He saw temples built and later defiled. He saw prophets crying out to deaf ears. He saw exile. He saw return. These came only in fragments, but enough for Moses to understand something humbling. He was not the end of the story either. As Abraham was not the end, as Joseph was not the end, he was a servant inside a much larger design. This stripped something from him and comforted him at once. He did not need to complete everything. He only needed to be faithful in his part. Then the vision narrowed again, bringing him back to the very question that had first haunted the edges of his mind. How do you write what you did not see? Now the answer was before him in living form, because he had seen it, not with human memory, not by standing there in the flesh when the world began, but by revelation, and perhaps more than revelation, because Moses also sensed that what was shown to him did not cancel the ancient memories passed down through fathers and families. It illuminated them. It purified them. It arranged them. It breathed divine authority into truths preserved across generations, but now gathered under the light of God's own self-disclosure. He understood that he was not inventing Genesis. He was receiving it, receiving the true beginning from the one who began all things. That realization filled him with fear, holy fear, because writing would now be an act of stewardship. Every word mattered. Every name carried weight. Every genealogy was not dead record, but living thread. Every story was a witness to covenant. Moses saw then why some things in the vision felt so personal and others so vast. Genesis was not written to satisfy curiosity alone. It was written to anchor identity. Israel needed to know who God was. Israel needed to know who they were. Israel needed to know what humanity was meant to be, how it fell, how judgment entered, how mercy remained, and how covenant began. Without Genesis, Sinai would be misunderstood. Without Genesis, Egypt would seem like the whole story. Without Genesis, Abraham's promise would hang without foundation. Without Genesis, the holiness of God would seem arbitrary rather than rooted in the very structure of creation. The beginning explained everything. Moses saw Adam naming creatures and understood dominion. He saw Eve and understood partnership. He saw Cain and Abel and understood worship twisted by the heart. He saw Enoch and understood fellowship that pleases God. He saw Noah and understood judgment joined with rescue. He saw Babel and understood the madness of collective pride. He saw Abraham and understood faith. He saw Lot and understood compromise. He saw Sarah and Hagar and understood the damage of impatient unbelief. He saw Isaac and Rebekah and understood generational blessing and blindness. He saw Jacob and Esau and understood hunger, deceit, election, and mercy. He saw Joseph and his brothers and understood providence through suffering. And through all of it, he saw God, not changing, not learning, not reacting like a man caught off guard. Moses stood in silence, letting that truth settle deep within him, because everything else in the world changed. Kings rose and fell. Empires expanded, then crumbled into dust. Men made promises, then broke them. Even the hearts of the people he led shifted like sand beneath the wind. But God did not change. The one who spoke light into existence was still the same one speaking to him now. The one who walked with Adam in the garden was the same one guiding Israel through the wilderness. The one who preserved Noah, who called Abraham, who protected Joseph in a foreign land, was the same God standing behind every step Moses had taken. And suddenly, something became clear. Genesis was never just about the beginning of the world. It was about the unchanging nature of the one who made it. That was the anchor. That was the reason the story mattered. Because if God does not change, then his promises do not change either. Not when people doubt. Not when circumstances collapse. Not when everything looks like it's falling apart. Moses took a slow breath. Now he understood why he had to write. Not just to record events, but to remind generations. To remind them that before slavery, there was promise. Before fear, there was purpose. Before brokenness, there was design. And even after everything fell apart, God was still there, still speaking, still calling, still restoring. He looked at the people once more, complaining, wandering, struggling, and yet chosen, not because they were perfect, but because God had made a covenant, the same way he always had. Moses lowered his head slightly, a quiet resolve forming inside him. Then he spoke the words that would echo across generations. In the beginning, and as his hand began to write, he knew something most people would never fully realize. He wasn't just writing history. He was revealing identity, not just where the world came from, but who God is. If this story made you see Genesis in a new way, make sure to like and subscribe for more powerful biblical stories. And now I want to ask you something. If God never changes, why do we so often live as if he does?